Tonight, we're learning new details in the death of legendary actor Gene Hackman.
Breaking news tonight. Because what federal investigators allegedly uncovered beneath the private estate of legendary actor Gene Hackman might be one of the most disturbing discoveries ever connected to a Hollywood icon. According to sources now quietly whispering behind closed doors, the investigation into the strange deaths at Hackman's secluded property near Santa Fe took a turn that nobody inside law enforcement was prepared for.
Because this wasn't supposed to be complicated. Two elderly people. A quiet mansion. A routine investigation. Case closed. At least, that's what everyone thought. But the moment federal agents began searching the lower levels of the estate, something changed. A section of the house that didn't appear on any architectural plans triggered unusual readings during a structural scan. And when investigators forced their way through the concealed entrance, they found it. A tunnel.
Deaths of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman and his wife, whose bodies were found in their Santa Fe home.
Not a modern basement corridor. Not a simple storage passage.
A deep stone tunnel descending into darkness beneath the mansion. And at the very end of it, an iron door.
No handle. No hinges visible. Just heavy steel covered in weld marks, sealed from the inside. Which raises a terrifying question investigators still can't explain. Who locked that door from the inside, and what exactly was meant to stay behind it? Because according to multiple anonymous sources close to the investigation, the FBI didn't just find an empty chamber. They found something that was never supposed to be discovered. The first officers who stepped onto the quiet property outside Santa Fe thought they were walking into a routine scene. At least, that's what the dispatch report suggested. Two elderly residents. No response to phone calls. A wellness check requested by someone who worked on the property. Simple. But nothing about what happened inside that estate belonging to Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy Arakawa would turn out to be simple. Because the moment deputies forced open the front gate, they realized something about the property felt wrong. The estate wasn't just a house. It was a fortress.
High perimeter walls surrounded the property like something out of a government compound.
Motion sensors were mounted along the fencing.
Security cameras pointed in every direction. Even the driveway itself curved through thick forest, hiding the main residence from view until the very last moment. Neighbors had always joked that the place looked less like a celebrity home and more like a private military installation. But that morning, the security system was still active.
And yet, nobody inside was answering.
When deputies finally made their way into the mansion, the silence inside the house was immediate and heavy.
No television playing. No music. No footsteps.
Just the faint sound of air moving through the ventilation system.
Then they found them.
Hackman and Arakawa, both deceased inside the home. Authorities would later state that the deaths appeared to be from natural causes. On paper, the explanation seemed straightforward enough.
Hackman was in his mid-90s.
Arakawa had reportedly been dealing with health complications. But the timeline created questions that investigators couldn't easily explain. According to preliminary medical estimates, Arakawa had passed away first,
nearly a week earlier.
Which meant the legendary actor, known for unforgettable performances in films like The French Connection and Enemy of the State, had spent several days inside that massive, silent house alone.
7 days. 7 days in a locked compound. 7 days without calling for help.
7 days without contacting friends, staff, or medical services.
And investigators couldn't figure out why.
The house phones were operational. Internet connections were active. Cell reception in the area was perfectly normal.
So why didn't he reach out to anyone? That question alone would have been unsettling.
But what deputies noticed next made the situation even stranger. The interior of the house looked disturbed.
Not destroyed. Not ransacked in the way a burglar might leave it. But certain things were clearly out of place. Furniture had been shifted across hardwood floors.
A desk drawer in the study hung partially open. Several books had been removed from shelves and stacked in uneven piles on the floor.
And then there was the safe.
Inside one of the bedrooms sat a heavy steel safe built into the wall.
It wasn't damaged. It wasn't forced open. It was simply empty.
Deputies later described the scene in quiet conversations as looking like someone had been searching for something.
Or trying to hide it.
At first, investigators assumed it might have been Hackman himself. Maybe the elderly actor had been looking for important documents. Maybe he had been searching for medication or emergency paperwork after his wife passed away. But then they checked the security footage. And that's where things became even more confusing. Because while the outer security cameras were still functioning, the internal camera system had been manually disabled.
Not broken. Disabled. Someone inside the house had shut them off.
1425 Old Sunset Trail, where Gene Hackman, 95, and his wife Betsy Arakawa, 65, and a dog were found deceased.
And according to the digital logs, that happened only a short time before the estimated window of Hackman's death. Which raised another uncomfortable question. Why would a 95-year-old man suddenly deactivate the cameras inside his own home?
Investigators began expanding their search of the property. Every room, every hallway, every storage area.
The estate was enormous, and deputies slowly worked their way through it. The mansion contained art pieces rumored to be worth millions.
Antique furniture, rare manuscripts,
Paintings collected during Hackman's decades in Hollywood.
It looked more like a museum than a private residence.
But the deeper investigators moved into the house, the more they began noticing small details that didn't appear in the official property records. One hallway ended at a wall that looked newer than the surrounding structure. Another section of flooring showed subtle signs of having been replaced at some point.
It wasn't obvious, but it was enough to make one investigator curious. So they brought in additional specialists, structural analysts, forensic technicians, engineers with ground scanning equipment.
And that's when the first real shock arrived. Because the architectural layout of the house didn't match the blueprint filed with the county. At first, investigators assumed it was simply a renovation that hadn't been properly documented. But when they scanned the structure more carefully, something unusual appeared beneath the library. A hollow space.
Large.
Much larger than a typical basement. It stretched beneath a section of the mansion that, according to official records, shouldn't have had anything underneath it at all.
At that point, the investigation changed.
What had started as a standard death inquiry was suddenly turning into something far more complicated. Deputies moved into the library. The room itself looked exactly like you'd expect from a retired Hollywood legend. Tall wooden shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of books filled the room. History, literature, biographies, even old Western novels. A large desk sat near the center of the room.
And at first glance, nothing about the space looked unusual.
But when investigators began examining the walls more closely, one section caught their attention.
The paneling didn't quite match. It was subtle,
but the grain of the wood ran in a slightly different direction than the surrounding panels. One investigator ran his hand along the edge
and felt something move. Hidden behind the paneling was a mechanism. Not a simple latch. Not a hinge. Something far more complex.
After several minutes of testing different pressure points along the wall, the panel suddenly shifted inward with a dull mechanical click.
And behind it,
a narrow stone stairway, descending straight into darkness beneath the house.
No lighting. No visible ventilation.
Just rough stone steps disappearing into the earth. For a moment, nobody moved, because this passageway wasn't listed on any property documents. It wasn't mentioned in any renovation permits. According to every official record, it shouldn't have existed.
Yet there it was.
A hidden tunnel beneath the home of Gene Hackman. And judging by the thick layer of dust coating the upper steps,
it had been there for a very long time.
But what investigators discovered after they started walking down those stairs
was far stranger than the tunnel itself.
The first thing investigators noticed as they descended the stone staircase was the temperature. With every step downward, the air became colder, heavier, almost metallic. Flashlights cut through the darkness, beams sliding across damp stone walls that looked nothing like the polished architecture of the mansion above. Up there, the house of Gene Hackman was elegant and refined.
Down here, it felt ancient.
The steps were uneven, worn down by time, as if people had been walking this passage for decades, maybe longer. And the deeper agents went, the clearer one disturbing fact became. This tunnel wasn't built recently. In fact, parts of it looked far older than the house itself. Rough chisel marks carved into the rock suggested manual excavation, tools striking stone again and again long before modern machinery existed. But mixed with those primitive cuts were sections reinforced with poured concrete and steel supports that looked mid-20th century. Which meant someone had renovated the tunnel at some point.
Expanded it. Strengthened it. Preserved it.
But for what purpose? The silence underground was almost oppressive. The only sounds were boots grinding against grit and the low hum of handheld equipment.
Then one of the agents stopped.
His flashlight had caught something strange on the wall. At first glance, it looked like random scratches carved into the stone. But the closer investigators looked, the clearer the pattern became. These weren't scratches. They were deliberate symbols. Carefully etched markings running along long sections of the tunnel walls.
Some resembled mathematical formulas.
Others looked almost like diagrams, circles connected by lines, arrows pointing towards strange mechanical shapes. One forensic technician later described the carvings as looking like a cross between engineering blueprints and alchemical notation. And they didn't stop. For nearly 50 feet, the walls were covered in these strange designs. Some symbols repeated again and again, while others appeared only once, as if marking specific locations along the passage. Investigators took photographs, unsure whether they were looking at historical markings or something far stranger.
But the tunnel still continued downward.
After several minutes of walking, the passage widened. The narrow corridor suddenly opened into a massive underground chamber.
And that's when the second shock hit. Because this wasn't just a tunnel. It was a storage facility.
Old wooden crates were stacked against the walls, some so deteriorated they had partially collapsed, spilling their contents onto the stone floor.
Dust hung thick in the air.
It was immediately obvious that no one had entered this chamber for a very long time.
At least, not recently.
Agents approached the first crate and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of old papers tied together with brittle string. Documents,
Yellowed with age.
Some pages had official-looking seals printed across the top, while others contained handwritten notes in faded ink. Names appeared in the margins.
Dates.
Locations.
But many of the lines had been deliberately blacked out.
Whoever created these files had clearly intended to hide certain details. Then investigators opened another crate.
This one held photographs. Dozens of them.
Black and white images curled at the edges with age. The photographs showed groups of people standing together in unfamiliar locations. Basements. Industrial rooms. Long tables covered with maps. The clothing styles looked decades old, some possibly from the early 1900s. But what truly unsettled the agents was what appeared on the back of several photos. Dates. Written by hand. And besides some of those dates, single words written in languages investigators couldn't immediately identify. Then something else caught their attention. Spread across the floor in the center of the chamber were strange patterns carved directly into the stone. Large circular shapes. Interlocking rings.
Precise lines forming complex geometric designs.
When viewed from above, the patterns resembled something oddly familiar.
Star charts. Constellations. Orbital paths.
Someone had carved astronomical maps directly into the chamber floor.
And they had done it with extraordinary accuracy.
One of the specialists later compared the layout to historical astronomical diagrams used to track planetary alignments. But the question remained. Why would something like that be carved into the ground beneath a private estate outside Santa Fe? The deeper investigators searched the chamber, the stranger the discoveries became. Some crates contained metallic objects with unknown functions, devices made of brass and steel with intricate rotating rings and internal mechanisms. One small cylinder appeared to have been forged as a single seamless piece of metal.
No joints. No screws. No visible way it had been assembled.
Even modern manufacturing would struggle to produce something like it. But the most unsettling discovery wasn't in the crates. It was hidden in the far corner of the chamber. At first, agents thought it was simply part of the rock wall. But when a flashlight beam swept across the surface, the shape became clear.
An iron door. Large. Heavy.
Built directly into the stone. The surface was covered in rust and weld marks running across every seam.
There were no hinges visible from the outside. No handle. No lock mechanism. Just a massive steel barrier embedded into the rock.
One of the investigators stepped closer and ran a gloved hand along the edge. The weld lines told a disturbing news.
The door had been sealed from the inside. Someone on the other side had welded it shut.
Which meant whoever closed that door had done so knowing they might never open it again. For a moment, nobody spoke. Because that single detail changed the entire situation. This wasn't a simple storage vault.
It wasn't a forgotten bunker. The door hadn't been designed to keep people out. It had been designed to keep something in.
And that's when the agents noticed something else on the chamber floor.
Footprints.
Not fresh, but recent enough to still be visible in the thin layer of dust.
They led toward the door. And then stopped.
Which meant someone had walked across that chamber not long before investigators arrived.
Someone who knew the tunnel existed. Someone who knew exactly where that door was.
And according to the timeline of the investigation,
that someone might have been Gene Hackman himself.
Because the hidden entrance inside the library showed clear signs of recent use.
Dust disturbed.
Mechanical components recently moved.
The passage had been opened. Not years ago. Not decades ago. Recently.
Which raises a question investigators still haven't been able to answer. Why would a 95-year-old man walk alone into a dark underground tunnel beneath his home, just days before he died?
And more importantly, what was he checking behind that sealed iron door? What happened next inside that underground chamber changed the entire direction of the investigation. Because the moment agents realized the sealed iron door had been welded from the inside, the question was no longer what this place was used for.
The real question became far more disturbing. Who had been on the other side of that door? The chamber fell silent as investigators studied the metal surface. The steel itself looked old, very old, but the weld marks sealing it shut told a different news.
They weren't ancient. They weren't even particularly aged. Some forensic specialists believed parts of the sealing work could have been done within the last few decades, which meant that at some point in relatively recent history, someone had deliberately closed that door forever.
But why?
Agents examined the surrounding wall carefully. The stone around the doorway had been reinforced with industrial bolts and heavy steel plates, construction methods that resembled security vaults more than ordinary underground structures. One structural consultant reviewing photographs later remarked that the door looked less like a basement entrance and more like containment.
Containment. That single word spread through the investigation team like electricity. Because if the structure had been designed to contain something, what exactly had been sealed behind it?
The deeper investigators examined the chamber, the more clues began pointing towards something much larger than a private hiding place. One of the crates near the far wall contained folders stamped with faded institutional markings. Some appeared to reference research programs dating back to the 1940s and 1950s. And that raised an eyebrow for a very specific reason. Just a short drive from Santa Fe sits one of the most historically secretive scientific locations in the United States. Los Alamos National Laboratory, the birthplace of the atomic bomb, the center of the Manhattan Project. For decades, the mountains and desert surrounding Santa Fe were filled with hidden research facilities, testing grounds, and underground infrastructure built during the Cold War. And according to several historians familiar with the region, many of those underground systems were never fully documented in public records.
Some were abandoned, some were sealed,
and some simply disappeared from official maps, which suddenly made the location of Hackman's estate far more interesting. Because if even a small portion of those underground networks extended beyond government property lines, it's possible that private landowners could have unknowingly inherited pieces of that hidden infrastructure. Or, more unsettling still, someone might have known exactly what they were buying when they purchased the land. Over the years, neighbors had occasionally reported strange things happening around the estate of Gene Hackman. Low vibrations late at night,
deep mechanical sounds coming from underground.
At the time, most people dismissed it as construction equipment or distant highway traffic. But a retired geologist who lived several properties away once conducted his own measurements out of curiosity. Using a portable seismometer, he recorded rhythmic vibrations beneath the ground during several nights in the summer. Not natural tremors, mechanical pulses, the kind produced by industrial equipment operating underground. He reportedly filed a complaint with local authorities. The report was never followed up. Then there were the stories from former employees. A gardener who worked at the estate years earlier reportedly told friends that certain areas of the property were strictly off-limits.
Not just the house, the land itself.
He once claimed security staff instructed workers never to dig beyond a specific depth when planting trees or installing irrigation lines. When he asked why, he was allegedly told something unusual. Because there are structures down there that don't belong to this house. At the time, most people assumed it was just celebrity paranoia. But now, with the discovery of the hidden tunnel and underground chamber,
those stories began to sound very different.
And investigators were about to uncover something even stranger. Because while the iron door remained sealed, the chamber itself contained another piece of equipment that hadn't been immediately recognized. Along one section of the wall ran a line of old communication wiring. Not telephone cable,
not internet fiber, something older.
A closed-circuit communication line. The wiring ran from the chamber wall directly upward toward the house above, straight into the structure. When technicians traced the line through the mansion, they discovered it terminated in a small concealed console hidden inside a storage room adjacent to the library. The equipment was outdated but still functional,
and it had clearly been maintained,
which meant someone inside the house had been able to communicate with someone, or something, inside the tunnel system without using any external network. No phones.
No internet. No record.
A completely isolated communication channel. Investigators stared at the equipment in disbelief. Because this meant the underground chamber wasn't just a forgotten relic.
It had been part of an active system,
at least at some point. And that realization raised one final question that investigators couldn't ignore.
Had Gene Hackman known about all of this? Or had he simply inherited a secret that existed long before he ever moved into that house? Some neighbors later recalled a strange conversation that took place years earlier. A woman who owned nearby property once casually mentioned to Hackman that she occasionally felt vibrations at night beneath her land. According to her account, the actor paused for a moment before responding. Then he simply said something cryptic. "Some things are better left below the surface." At the time, she thought he was joking. But now, looking back, she wondered if he had been telling the truth. Because the most haunting detail in the entire investigation remained one simple fact. The hidden tunnel entrance inside the library showed clear evidence of recent use. Someone had opened it shortly before the deaths occurred. Someone had gone down those stairs. Someone had walked across that chamber floor, toward that sealed iron door. And the only person known to have been inside the house during that time was Hackman himself. Which means in the final days of his life, the legendary star of films like The French Connection may have descended into that dark tunnel beneath his own home. But what he saw down there, and whether that sealed door ever opened, remains one of the most chilling unanswered questions in the entire case. And now the question refuses to go away. What exactly was hidden beneath the estate of Gene Hackman? Because when you step back and look at the full picture, the mystery only gets darker. A sealed underground tunnel, strange artifacts, files connected to decades-old programs, a communication system hidden off the grid, and at the very end of that chamber, a welded iron door that appears to have been closed from the inside. Authorities have remained almost completely silent about what investigators actually documented beneath the property outside Santa Fe. No detailed press conferences, no clear explanation, no confirmation about what might exist beyond that door, which is unusual. Because in most investigations involving celebrity deaths, information leaks quickly. Sources talk. Reports surface. But in this case, nothing. And sometimes, silence tells its own news. Was that tunnel part of an abandoned Cold War system connected to nearby facilities like Los Alamos National Laboratory? Did Hackman unknowingly inherit something buried beneath the land long before he arrived? Or was he protecting a secret that someone else desperately wanted to keep hidden? Right now, nobody outside the investigation knows the full truth. But one thing is certain. Whatever lies behind that sealed door has remained buried for a very long time. And if it was never meant to be discovered, the real news might only be beginning. So what do you think is hidden behind that door? Drop your theory in the comments below. And if you want to stay updated when the next piece of this mystery surfaces, make sure you subscribe, because this news may be far from over.